So, U.S. President Donald Trump now says Washington doesn't need help after most allies rejected his calls to secure the Strait of Hormuz. And this comes as global uncertainty escalates, with the U.S. even seeking to delay Trump's visit to China, which was initially set for 2 weeks from now. For more, we're joined today by Brian Myers, Professor of International Studies at Dongseo University. Professor Myers, thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure.
So, after Australia, Germany, and Japan said they weren't planning to participate, President Trump even said it was actually a loyalty test. So, if the U.S. doesn't need help protecting the waterway, what's really behind Washington's move?
Well, I think that saying that his request was just a loyalty test may be just a way of saving face now that his administration has been humiliated by the lack of a response from any of America's allies. But as some South Korean experts were saying about this all along, this may be more about financial burden sharing than about military cooperation anyway. So now the Americans have asked for help. The allies have refused to provide it. And now President Trump can say, well, all right, the least you can all do now is pay a lot more for your own defense. But, the president has been contradicting himself so often over the past few days, and sometimes in the same speeches, that it's hard to tell when he means what he says.
I see. And how should South Korea respond in this situation? How realistic, is it for South Korea to provide support in safeguarding the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, the alliance between Korea and America rests on a defense treaty, not an offense treaty. So it doesn't apply if either America or Korea starts a war. So I think South Koreans do not need to feel like they're being bad allies here if they're not enthusiastic about rushing into the Strait of Hormuz, which would be, I think, a very reckless thing for the government to do. Now, in the past, during the two Gulf Wars, South Korea managed to keep the Americans happy without making enemies in the Middle East. And perhaps that can be done this time, too. For example, South Korea might be able to dispatch non-combat forces to serve in some kind of auxiliary function somewhere out of harm's way. But the National Assembly would have to approve of such a thing. And my sense is that the ruling party would probably vote against it at this point.
Right. And while that's happening in North Korea, the regime fired ballistic missiles over the weekend with Kim Jong-un and his daughter Chue reportedly overseeing that test. Is this another move to publicly signal that Kim Jong-un is likely to become the next leader?
Well, I think that by keeping her in the public eye at events like this, the regime really just wants to make very clear that North Korea will remain a de facto monarchy one way or the other. So the leader is saying, in effect, not just to his own people, but also to the outside world, don't get any strange ideas about regime change because power will stay in this family even after I go. That's the main signal. But this does not necessarily mean that Kim Joo-ae has to be the successor, because for all we know, the leader has a son somewhere who he wants to keep out of the limelight for a few more years, perhaps for security reasons. But one way or another, the Baekdu dynasty seems likely to continue into the next generation.
I see. And North Korea also says its newly elected Supreme People's Assembly will convene its first session this weekend for a constitutional revision. What should we expect?
Well, the Constitution is less important in North Korea than the charter of the Workers' Party. And that charter was amended last month to enshrine Kim Jong-un's new doctrine that South Korea is not a partner on the road to unification. It's a hostile state, and it must be treated accordingly. Now, an amendment in that vein was already made to the Constitution, but everybody now expects a much more thorough revision of it, including a very clear definition of what North Korea's borders are. And this is relevant to South Korea because if the North says our southern border is the DMZ, some people here may start calling for South Korea's constitution to start saying that this country's northern border is the DMZ, which would be a departure from Article 3, which now says that the Republic of Korea extends over the entire peninsula. So it's something that I think a lot of South Korean people are keeping an eye on.
Right, and North Korea is, still largely closed to tourists, but passenger train services between Beijing and Pyongyang were put back on track last week for the first time in 6 years, and direct flights are also expected to resume soon. What does this tell us about relations between North Korea and China?
Well, it doesn't tell us a whole lot, but I think it's enough to put to rest any rumors that China and North Korea are squabbling or on bad terms. Western media have, for a few years now, been quite eager to play up the disunity inside the so-called authoritarian camp of Russia, China, and North Korea. But these restored connections give the lie to that, I think. On the other hand, Kim does not seem very eager to let large numbers of Chinese tourists back into the country, whereas 5,000 Russian tourists visited North Korea last year. So my sense is that all three countries, Russia, China, and North Korea, are getting along fine, but the North is likely to continue prioritizing its relationship with Russia.
I see. All right, Professor Myers, thanks for taking the time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.